Have you ever wondered how people can have access to the exact same information and yet perceive a situation entirely differently? In this video, I'm going to shed light on how this happens, and in order to do this, I'm going to need to walk you through the three phases of the perception process, which are selection, organization, and interpretation. Okay? So let's talk about the selection phase of the perception process, or phase one. Okay? There are three steps under this phase, and they are selective exposure, selective attention, and selective retention. Okay? Selective exposure is simply the choices we make to experience or avoid certain material. Or simply put, what we choose to expose ourselves to. What information are we showing to ourselves? By this definition, everything that we do is selective exposure. Okay, so the fact that you clicked onto this video, you chose to expose yourself to the information in the video. Right? If I have a conversation with a friend, I'm choosing to expose myself to whatever information he may tell me. If I turn on the TV, right, and I watch TV, I'm choosing to expose myself to the material on the TV. Let's say I change the channel, right? I'm choosing to avoid the information on that channel and expose myself to the information on another channel. So literally everything that we do is selective exposure. Okay. Step two is selective attention. Simply put, selective attention has to do with the information that we focus on within the information that we're shown. Okay, so simply put, what information do we pay attention to within the information we're shown? So imagine for a second that I'm an avid dog lover and a cat hater. Okay? And I see an article that is titled 5 Cute Things Dogs Did and 5 Cute Things Cats Did. Okay? And I read the article. What information do you think I'm going to focus on? What do you think I'm going to pay attention to? Probably the 5 cute things that dogs did, because I think, right, I love dogs. Okay? And I might ignore, right, or not pay as much attention to the 5 cute things that cats did. Right? That's selective attention. Okay? And then the third step is called selective retention. And this is really simple. This is what we choose to remember, either consciously or unconsciously. Okay? So, for example, that same article, if I read the entire article, 5 cute things dogs did, 5 cute things that cats did, what information do you think I'm going to remember, given the fact that I'm an avid dog lover? I'm likely going to remember the 5 cute things that dogs did, and maybe I just disregard the 5 cute things that cats did because I hate cats. Okay? Now, that concludes the selection phase of the perception process, right? So you can see people expose themselves to different pieces of information. They pay attention to different messages or different pieces of information, and they remember different pieces of information. Okay? Let's go ahead and move into the organization phase of the perception process, or phase two. Okay? For this phase, I want you guys to imagine that your brain is a filing cabinet with 3 different drawers, and those drawers are titled closure, proximity, and similarity. And in each drawer, there's an unlimited amount of folders. Okay, so let's go ahead and open the closure drawer. Okay? Closure, the closure drawer is full of folders that contain information that all lead to the same conclusion. Okay? So, drawing upon that same example, if I think dogs are amazing creatures, right? I may have a folder in there that's full of every positive interaction I've ever had with dogs, every amazing thing I've ever heard of a dog doing, any positive information that I've learned about dogs through my research, right? That's called closure. Okay, so we store information that all leads to the same conclusion. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and shut the closure drawer, and let's go ahead and open up the proximity drawer. Okay. The proximity drawer is full of folders of things that often appear together. Okay, so I may have a folder in there just full of different ice cream toppings, because every time that I go and get ice cream, I get the same few toppings, right? So I might have in that folder sprinkles, caramel syrup, fudge, right, or anything else that I put on my ice cream. Okay, so that's an example of proximity, things that often appear together. Okay. Let's go ahead and shut the proximity drawer and open up the similarity drawer. This drawer is full of folders that contain things that resemble one another. Okay, so a simple example of this might be ice cream and frozen yogurt. Okay, we're going to keep those in the same folder. We're going to group them together because they resemble one another. Okay, so those are the three different ways that we organize things mentally. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and move into the third phase of the perception process, which is called interpretation. Okay? Now, for this phase, I just want to talk about different reasons why people interpret the same information differently. Okay? One massive reason for this has to do with people's past experiences. I want you to imagine for a second that you have had 3 interactions with police officers, and each one has been very positive. Let's say the first interaction, you called the police because somebody broke into your home, and the police showed up and detained the man and possibly saved your life. Okay? Your second interaction, you were pulled over and you were speeding, but the cop was respectful and polite and very nice and ended up letting you off with a warning. And let's imagine your third interaction has to do with a friend of yours who you hold in high regard, and that person happens to be a police officer. Now, I want you to imagine that you see a police officer using force to arrest a man on the side of the road. You're likely going to interpret that situation, right, positively for the police officer. You're likely going to be like, well, that man was probably a threat to society. The police officer had to use necessary force in order to detain him and protect, right, the people in the area. Okay? Now I want you to imagine you see that same scenario, a police officer using force to arrest a man on the side of the road. However, your only 3 interactions with police officers were negative. Right? So imagine the first time, your first experience with a police officer a couple years ago, you were wrongfully arrested. Okay? Your second interaction, you were pulled over. You were only going 2 miles an hour over the speed limit, and the cop gave you a ticket anyway. Right? And your third interaction, right, the police officer was incredibly rude and demeaning to you. How are you likely going to interpret that same scenario? Right? You're much more likely to think, man, here we go again, a cop using unnecessary force to detain someone. Right? So this is a simple example of how our past experiences can cause us to interpret the exact same information wildly differently. Okay? Another reason, the second reason people may interpret the same information differently has to do with other people's opinions. Okay? If all my friends interpret a scenario, a bunch of information one way and I interpret it the other way, I'm very likely to kind of check my own perception and be like, well, am I interpreting this correctly? All my friends think this. Right? So that affects the way we interpret information. The third one I want to touch on is the source of the information. I want you guys to think about the current political climate right now. Okay? I want you to imagine for a second, right, that you are on the right, right? Let me say this. If you're on the right, right, you might listen to Fox News. If you're on the left, you might listen to CNN or MSNBC, right? Something like that. Now I want you to imagine that you're on the right and CNN publishes a story. You are much more likely to interpret that story as being false than someone who's on the left, right? Now imagine you're on the left and Fox News publishes a story, right? You're much more likely to perceive that story as being propaganda than somebody who's on the right. Okay? And this actually leads me into the last thing that I want to touch on, the last reason people interpret information differently. And it has to do with what we already believe. Right? So if I already believe that CNN is fake news, right, and they publish a story, I'm likely not going to deviate from that. I'm going to interpret that story as fake. Or if I think Fox News is propaganda, I'm likely not going to deviate from that belief. Right? So their next story I'm going to perceive or interpret it as propaganda. Okay? So those are 4 easy examples of reasons why people interpret the same information differently. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. You could make a list that is just hundreds of items long of things that affect the way we interpret information that we're presented with. So this actually concludes the perception process. Again, we went through phase 1 being selection, phase 2 being organization, and phase 3 being interpretation. So the next time you see somebody who perceives the same situation wildly differently than you do, I want you to think back through this process, okay? Maybe they exposed themselves to different information than you. Maybe they paid attention to different information than you. Maybe they remembered different information than you did. Maybe they organized it differently in their brains. And finally, maybe they interpreted it differently than you did due to their past experiences, the source of the information, what they already believe, or other people's opinions.